And I wanted to also include this one, which was more recent, which is a lot more down to earth story and probably resonates with quite a few people, but also touches on the fact that history is still happening now. You know, and that just because we talk about all these things and we can look at where we've been in the past and how far we've come, it's also worth remembering at times that there is still a way to go. And this story really resonated with me, and it was like, oh yeah, and I felt I couldn't not tell it, sort of thing. So to crack open this fun one, you'll all
can't wait.
So Sarah Hegazi was an Egyptian socialist writer and lesbian activist. Born in 1989, she was the eldest of 4 siblings, and she would actually help her mother look after the rest of her siblings when her father passed away earlier in her life. She was so clever, so clever. She, you know, got a bachelor's degree in information systems with the American University in Cairo, continuing her education center. There was, through distance learning, she also completed the certificates for Fighting for Equality, 1950 to 2018, Feminism and Social Justice, Research Methods, Diversity and Inclusion in the Workplace, and also Understanding Violence. And that was through a variety of different universities, both in the US, in London as well. So there was a lot of online learning early in her life, and well, in 2010. And she actually, it was in September 2017, she was attending a concert for the Lebanese band Mashral, whose Mashral Leela, whose lead singer is actually openly gay. And so this event was happening in Cairo. And obviously Sarah was there with a group of others, and they were waving about rainbow flags in support of LGBTQ rights, as obviously a lot of people that go to concerts these days where you've got openly queer representation on stage, you know, a lot of people feel very comfortable waving that pride flag, letting that singer know, you know, they see that singer, but also they want to be seen by that person that is expressing things that they have also felt. So she was actually charged with charged with joining an organization to contravention of the law to incite acts of immorality and debauchery.
What because for that?
Because she waved a LGBTQ plus flag. Yes.
Is that joining? What? I feel like those are some very difficult. Just how did you put that case together? What?
So yes, Egypt. It's one of those places where it is not illegal as such in the law. But what happened was this concert and the incident actually coincided with Egypt's approach to a zero tolerance crackdown to end support for LGBTQ plus rights in Egypt. So part of this was seen as they've done a thing and we want to crack down on this thing. So we're going to make an example out of these people who happen to, you know, be a group of people that were rounded up because they waved this flag. And obviously they were then seen as being an organization instead of people that happened to be at the gig at the same time.
Yeah. Oh, goodness. So she was basically in the wrong place at the wrong time. And they thought, we are just going to make an example of these people. And she happened to be one of those people.
Yeah. And because the LGBTQ plus community is basically posited as a sort of national security threat by the Egyptian government, religious authorities, and also political parties. Because, you know, the gays are clearly as dangerous as nukes or other terrorist organizations out there.
That's because they've discovered that we have a gay agenda. And now they know that there's an agenda. They're feared for their lives.
Yes, clearly they're afraid they're on the agenda.
Of all the things to be afraid of, honestly, I would think you've got much bigger problems in society than that.
So obviously, again, as I'm just going to say, as we're talking a bit about Sarah's arrest, I'm just going to, again, say there is a trigger warning for this part specifically around, assault and abuse of power and all the things that you can imagine a state government trying to oppress people might employ. So I would recommend, if you are not feeling up for that, just jump ahead for a bit. So she was jailed for 3 months. And obviously male agents had actually incited other inmates to both beat her and verbally and sexually assault her as well, because of her waving that pride flag and showing her support for LGBTQ+ rights. And she had actually written that when she was released, she had written about it, publicly, and explained that she'd been arrested at home in front of her family. So not only was she going through that trauma, but her siblings and her mother were having to watch her be arrested. And obviously during the process, the officers had even questioned her about her religion, why she'd stopped wearing her hijab, which she had actually worn up until 2016, where she then came out as a lesbian. So it was only when she chose, when she realized her sexuality, that she had felt she did not want to wear the hijab. But again, there were questions on that, as well as whether or not she was a virgin. And also that the fact that after that questioning, she was blindfolded and they took her by car to a location she didn't know about. So there was a lot of
actual kidnap, really, isn't it?
Yeah, state-sponsored kidnapping, all to intimidate and oppress people that aren't actually causing harm to the state.
I can't even imagine just how terrifying that would be. Like, it's just, it's unthinkable. Oh.
Yeah, it really does remind you sometimes of the privilege of where you're born, the sheer luck of where you're born and the sort of community that you have around you. So yeah, it was something that, Sarah went through because of homophobia in her own country. There was, basically state-sponsored terrorism against its own people, as far as I'm concerned. Because she was also, at some point she was gagged with a cloth. She was treated to electric shock, and she was also threatened that her mother would be harmed at some point during her ordeal. But she was eventually released, after her 3 months, and she was fined 1,000 Egyptian pounds, which is $56. So it's not really the fact that there was a hefty fine to it, but obviously all the emotional and physical abuse that had happened throughout that ordeal. And
like
that was something.
Her. Like, she deserves the money. You pay her as compensation.
Yeah, all that because somebody wants to live their life authentically and just be themselves.
Right? All this came from just waving a flag. Like nothing, nothing else happened.
Yeah. So after her release, obviously, surprisingly, for somebody that's been through that ordeal, Sarah did have depression, panic attacks, post-traumatic stress disorder. And at some point after that ordeal, because she feared for the prosecution that could happen again, because, the system hadn't changed, she had sought asylum in Canada in 2018. So she did leave Egypt and go over to Canada. However, in 2020, in June, she actually passed away, and it was confirmed that her death was because of suicide.
Oh, how sad.
Yep.
Oh, all the people that did that to her, just, I don't know if they'll ever realize what they did. I hope they feel guilty for the rest of their lives. Appalling.
It is, it's actually disgusting that it happened to somebody, especially somebody that was their citizen, and the state is there to protect its citizens, every single one of them. It's not there to abuse. And so there was a short letter written by Hegazi. So it was circulated, and I'm just going to read a part of it because I thought it summed up, obviously, what you could imagine a lot of people who have been through that might feel. And so she did write, "To my siblings, I tried to survive and failed. Forgive me. To my friends, the experience was harsh and I am too weak to resist it. Forgive me. To the world, you were cruel to a great extent, but I forgive." so yeah, it was, the fact that this was somebody that was basically 30 years old, that ended up taking their own life because of how their own country treated them. And, there was obviously an outpouring from the queer community afterwards. Oh, look at that, crying on camera, isn't that? Ending on a high.
It sounds like even at the end, she lived with grace and humility, and there's just no hate, not hateful in her body.
Yeah. And yeah, there was obviously a lot of outpouring from the LGBTQ plus community. The singer of the band that she'd went to see when she got arrested, they'd actually dedicated a song to her. There were murals in various cities around the world. There was even the Association for Women's Rights and Development actually named her in their tribute to 450 feminist activists who have changed the world. And so there was a lot of outpouring and, pain that, again, somebody's life was cut so short because people were just intolerant and bigoted and couldn't be bothered to accept differences in their own society. And yeah, I wish it could be a super happy ending, but again, people in Egypt as well as Jordan and other places in the Middle East didn't necessarily understand what they'd done wrong, with street murals and graffiti art in Jordan being covered up and, were basically blacked out. So where there were rainbow flags with Sarah's image over it or her words, those were covered up as quick as possible. Talked about not being, Arab culture or Islamic culture. There was obviously a lot of online homophobia and transphobia smear campaign against her in Egypt at the time. And even the Arabic Wikipedia had removed her page, which caused a lot of consternation and discussions around the fact that why would you try and erase somebody's importance? And the fact that they were trying to claim that there was a lack of sufficient notability for Sarah was one of the reasons given for trying to take her off the Arabic version of Wikipedia.
Has anything positive come from what happens? Like in the aftermath, has there been any takeaways where people have learned, things have improved, anything at all?
So obviously there is, a lot of people sort of, again, waking up to the understanding that there are still places in the world that are not LGBTQ plus friendly, and there's a lot of way to push both in, North Africa, but also the Middle East. And so, yeah, although it seems like her native country and those surrounding it have not necessarily learned their lessons, there were a lot of people that were touched by Sarah's story. And obviously there was that outpouring of grief. There was, the naming of her as a key feminist for changing the world. There was also the Arab Network for Knowledge About Human Rights released a statement on behalf of 42 regional and international queer rights organizations commemorating her, and announcing a Pride Day for lesbian and queer women for the Middle East and North Africa. So there was a lot of push as well to, again, push forward those LGBTQ plus rights, which are basically human rights within the region, and making sure that we're challenging censorship, hate speech, government coordinated persecution and terrorism, because it's government terrorism at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And so
she has had ripples around. She's had ripples around the world then, even if her own country still is struggling with dealing with these kind of things appropriately. But at least, her presence has been felt elsewhere.
Yeah, and there's murals over in Canada, in the US, there's in Paris. There's also one in the UK down in Brighton. So I think it would be great if, when we're allowed to travel, when, England isn't a hot spot for COVID, when Scotland isn't a hot spot for COVID, it might be nice as a couple of sisters to maybe go down there, because obviously she passed during the coronavirus pandemic. So obviously, we've not had the chance to properly look at those things. But yeah, I thought it was worth sharing Sarah's story because it highlights the fact that no matter how far we've come, there is still so much more to go, and that we can't be complacent. And as we see it every day, not just with transphobia, rising in the UK, but in other places around the world where hate speech and bigotry is, again, challenging people in new and horrible ways in the 21st century. Again, making sure we're not taking these hard-won rights for granted, and that we're continuing to push so that we're not just comfortable in how we live, and we can gussy up in our fabulous outfits as much as we want in Scotland, but also making sure that our siblings around the world also have that opportunity and that availability. So, queer history, as much as it's about remembering what's come before us, it's also about making sure we're inspiring people to make that history going forward as well, in my view anyway, which is why I wanted to share this.
Agreed. I think that was a really important story. And as you say, it's not as far back in history, but it's actually a story that we need to make sure is told, and that, people continue to talk about this story.
Mm-hmm.